Welcome to the Power Lunch live on LinkedIn. This is Rhett Power, your host. Was it Tuesday already? And we're going to have shows all week. It's exciting. We're going to have shows this afternoon as well. We've got a special edition this afternoon. And so we're going to have a few extra shows this week, but that's fun to me. I enjoy it. We normally do the show around 12 noon Eastern Standard Time on LinkedIn's new live platform. The point of the show is to talk to today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, CEOs, people who are doing amazing work in the world that we can learn from. And that's the whole reason why we do this, so that we can get better at what we do. Our guests are typically give us a lot of information to think about and to try to work on ourselves and in our businesses. Now, the fun part about the show also is that it's interactive. So if you have a question for the guest or for me, please do ask it on social media. We can answer it live on the air. And we did a couple of those yesterday with our guest. So please do ask your questions. It's a way for you to learn and get to the information that you want to get to. Now, if you like the program, give it a like or share so that your network can benefit from these conversations as well. You can also find the program. We're simulcasting on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all with the help of Social Live. Now, my guest today is an amazing person, an amazing coach, an amazing entrepreneur. Dr. Lois Sonstegard is a Marshall Goldsmith certified coach. She's an author, speaker, researcher, innovator, and coach. She's got 55 trademarks and patents that she's put out with throughout her companies. She's just an amazing, very accomplished person that I wanted to have on the show again, so that I could learn some things from her, and hopefully you do too. Dr. Lois, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rhett. What a privilege to be with you and your audience today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Your story is remarkable. I mean, I want to get to why you ended up being a coach, but I mean, you've started several companies. You've sold, I think you sold a company as well. I mean, you've had this remarkable journey that I want to hear about, or I want our audience. I've heard about it, but I want our audience to hear about it as well.
Sure, I'd be glad to share. You know, my background is so circuitous. If you look at it from an HR standpoint, there's nothing about what I've done that's made sense. And I think that is something that I think is important for people to hear today, because we tend to have rather linear impressions of what it is that we need. Mm-hmm. And I think the next generation of employees that are going to really transform our companies are going to be people who perhaps haven't had quite a linear path. They're going to bring very different perspectives into companies. So let me share with you what my background is. I started out in healthcare, running women's and children's services at the University of Minnesota, and then went down to the University of Texas at Lubbock to put into medical school education. I was asked by the head of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology to bring into that department some of the innovations that we had done at the University of Minnesota. And in particular, there were two things, but there's one thing that I want to focus on because it really has been sort of a foundation that has rooted me in many of the directions in which I went. And in one of the areas that we worked in at the University of Minnesota was gynecological cancer. And we had an agreement with community hospitals that at that time we would only take terminally ill patients. We worked with the communities for them to provide the services up until that point. At that point, then, they came to the university for experimental treatments. Our results were not good because they were terminal. And so there was a tremendous amount of turnover, depression, burnout amongst everybody. The medical staff was burned out. The nursing staff was burned out. Turnover for nursing was at 180% per year. It was too much. And it took about 18 months to train them. So it meant that you didn't have fully equipped people. So we put together a whole system. And this is what I have learned over the years. I've come back to it over and over again. Every part that touched our outcome was what we needed to partner with. So our outcome was to give a better result, a better life result, quality of life to the terminally ill patient and their family, whether that meant we would go on to be able to provide them with a future life, or that the quality of life that they had left would be what they wanted it to be. And so when you look at all the people that impact, that's a lot of people. So I put together a program for the chaplaincy staff. I put together a program for the pharmacy, for the physicians, for the residents, for the wives of the residents. I needed everybody enrolled if we were going to change and impact outcomes. When we began that process, that particular unit was the least desired place to work. No one wanted to work there. I couldn't get people to work there. So we put this piece in place. Also, a whole piece went in place for the nursing staff. Mm-hmm. And what happened was people now began to look at, what am I doing to impact a change? There was an excitement about it. It was, really what I do is going to make a difference and somebody cares? Now people who were disgruntled and unhappy were beginning to think. So patients who had never thanked a doctor, for example, were now making cookies and thanking the physician. That changed how they viewed their care and treatment, right? So in that whole process, after about a 2-year program, it became the most sought after place in the hospital to work. And our terminally ill patients, the outcome, the mortality began to drop significantly. So what I learned was that when you create, what we did in that process was we created a trusting environment, right? And that came out of providing hope for everybody. It couldn't just be for the patients. We had to provide hope for the doctors, for the nursing staff, for everybody who was a part of touching that outcome. And when we did, that increased trust. And when we increased trust, we increased engagement. We increased engagement. We changed the results, and we improved our revenue. We decreased our expenses. So what we do has a tremendous impact on that. It was life that we were giving by what we did. From there, I would put some of those same programs in place at Texas Tech University, and then came back to the University of Minnesota and continued with my doctoral work and some of my research. And at that time, we had our first child who had been born prematurely, and he was my next major learning experience, because he was born prematurely and had numerous problems. And by 3rd grade, we were told he would never read, write, or do math. And we took him to several places for second opinions, Harvard, Mayo, and they confirmed that there was no case in literature that would offer any optimistic outcome for us. And so at that time, I was the head of my department at the university, which is great because that means you go to department head meetings. And I would talk with everybody about their research and how does that electrical engineering piece of research that you're doing apply to the brain? And I'd listen and I'd think about it. And then I'd go home and put together a program for my son. And in the process, he did go on. He did begin to read. He did gain math skills. He went on, did his MBA, his CPA, and now is CFO of a Fortune 100 company and lives abroad. So, pardon me. So what I learned from that is we take a look at a lot of things as being fixed or finite.
Right.
That was also what we were doing at the University of Minnesota with our cancer patients. It was fixed. The diagnosis was fixed. We do the same thing with our companies. We look at them as this is what's happening. It's finite. It's fixed. And so then we operate within that set of parameters that we set forth. So while I was involved in working with trying to put systems in place for my son, I was being recruited to another position in another state and realized that he was not movable. We needed to keep things more stable. So I said, okay, what do I do with myself now? And decided that I needed to do something that absolutely allowed me to control my time and allowed me to be able to put the time where I needed to put it for him. And so I started a manufacturing company and did it in the hair business, totally outside of any field that I had any knowledge of, and began working in that around the world. We developed it into selling in 18, 20 different countries. And as you said, we have about 55 patents and trademarks at this point. During that time, I also had the opportunity to work with the city of Minneapolis and with our biotech corridor to look at how do we build business relationships, particularly in Japan. I grew up in Japan, so I'm fluent in that culture and grew up with the language. And so those ties were a natural place where they came to me because, in a sense, I was bicultural. I was a person of both cultures. And so we started taking people over there to build business relationships and partnerships. And what I realized, Rhett, was before we even left, I could tell you who would come home with no business at all, right? Mm-hmm. You could tell it by who people presented themselves to be. Ego versus humility. People who had large egos, they couldn't traverse cultural differences. People who were humble, on the other hand, they were so secure in who they were and what they knew, they could embrace and take in other people. Those were the people who developed partnerships. It was really fascinating to watch.
That is.
And, pardon me?
No, that is. It's very fascinating.
So yeah, we could work on that, so many times. And the other place where I began to realize that was with working with multinational companies. There's almost two cultures that get formed. It is the expat culture, and then you have the national culture. And I was in a meeting with a group one time, and one of the nationals said to me, "But you're not like everybody else." And I said, "What do you mean?" And her comment was, I wasn't treating her as the expats had been treating her. It was the expats who run the company versus the people who do the work in the nation. And there was a difference, a differentness about that, how they socialized varied. So the engagement was also very different. And interestingly, if you look at Gallup's research right now, in Japan, engagement is only 9%, which is astronomically poor.
That's awful.
Right? And it's a culture that is so embracing of so many things. And you say, why? Why does that happen? Doesn't need to be. So it's those kinds of questions that brought me into the coaching world. Because you go, why is it that we have these problems? They don't need to be, right? One of the people that you and I both know, Denise Hamill, I think her work with diversity integration is just brilliant. I think what she will offer to corporations is something that's deeply, deeply needed. And when I look at that, and I look at the whole concept of engagement, when you get people really excited and involved and a part, they're important in terms of making something happen, there is inclusion. You don't have to have a discussion about inclusion. It's there because that person's there because they're really important and vital to the process.
Right. And they know it. And they know.
Yeah.
It's not contrived. It's not manufactured. It's not an effort. It just is. It's just there. Yeah.
And I think that's what people are hungry for. People back years ago when I was working at the University of Minnesota, with women and children. That's what they were hungry for. They wanted to be included. They wanted to be a part of making a difference. It's when I finish with life and I look back, well, I have made a difference in anybody's life at all. And along with that, Rhett, I think one of the things that we get so caught up in is money. And I think money is important. So when I started working with, whether it's multinationals or even with the cancer patients and some of the other programs, we had some people that were brought in from some of the pharmaceutical companies that I was working with, because I enrolled their help. I needed their help as well to get some of these things done. And they said, Lois, you'll never get this done because you can't pay people more. They're already getting as much as they're going to ever get. And so I started talking with people about that. And what I realized is there's three things, and these three things come in this order. One, what are my relationships with my colleagues? Do you care about me? Right? And that's what millennials are telling us right now is, do you care about me? Right? The second thing was communication. Are you bothering to communicate with me? And then those two things weren't in place. Then came the issue of money. Okay, if you're not going to treat me well and you're not going to talk with me, then at least pay me. That's sort of the way it works. But I think that's true today too.
Oh, absolutely. What do you think it takes to build a culture that the ideal culture that we're talking about, where innovation happens and people feel connected and appreciated and like their work matters, or they understand their purpose, right? They understand why they're doing what they're doing and how how their little piece of it is connected to the larger goal. Because that's where I see a lot of disconnect, right? Where does my work matter in the scheme of things?
Where does my work matter? And are we honest about it? I think people are less worried about things being chaotic or a mess,
right,
if we're at least willing to be honest about it.
Right.
If I go to a place and they say, no one does this, right? But if you said, we really can't stand people, we'll get rid of you in 3 months if you don't produce this, this, and this. And, you go with your list of really what does exist many times in the minds of leaders. And you said that up front, people would laugh and they'd say, well, forget it, I'm not coming here. Or you'd say, okay, I'll come if you pay me enough, right? That would be the perspective. So I think what happens is, I recently spoke with a woman who is in the director level, just under C-suite level, okay? And she said, what do you do when an organization has two cultures? And I said, what do you mean by that?
That's interesting.
How do you have two cultures, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, well, the C-suite, the leadership has a culture, and then everybody else has another culture. And so what she was saying to me is, this was such an aha for me, and a conviction to me as a coach, is we tend to focus on the leaders at the top, right?
Right.
And we're looking at transformation there. But we don't necessarily look at how do we get it down into the bottom of the system.
Right.
So I was working with, because I do manufacturing, I love manufacturing. I love the people who do the work and produce things, because you learn a lot from them, right? Innovation comes from listening to the people who are doing it. And they'll say to you, but why do we do it this way? Couldn't we just tweak it this way a little bit? And you go, wow, didn't think about that, right? But I have to go there, be present, see it, to observe it. So I was talking with this HR director who is responsible for a mid-sized manufacturing company. And we were talking about some of their engagement levels and things like that, the organization. I said, one of the things that would be where I really get great enjoyment is in going to the back back to the factory and talking with your workers, because if we're going to develop this here, let's see what they think over here, and let's look at how to integrate. And she looked at me and she said, well, all of our training programs are for the people in the offices. It's not for the line workers. That's two cultures.
Yeah.
Right? We have one way of dealing with people here, another way of dealing with people there. You can't get innovation that way. You can't get engagement that way. People know the difference.
Oh yeah, they say it's clear, right? You don't. To me, that says you don't matter. If I work out on the floor, I can't get better at my job. I might have ambition, right? I might be working my way through college so that I can get into that C-suite one day, right? But if I don't have any way to do it, I'm not going to stay. I might look at it as just a job to get me through college. It doesn't build any loyalty, does it?
People aren't going to innovate today, I don't think, Rhett, unless they feel there's a sense of trust and you care. Because why should I share my ideas with you? You're going to make money off of me, but I'm not. I think there's a real push-pull that we're beginning to see. And I think the companies of the future that are going to be very innovative, that are going to be out there, that are going to be doing things, are people who, companies that, first of all, let their people know that they're important. Every one of them is important. So, one of the things I've toyed with, and I've not implemented it, I kind of loosely have, both in my manufacturing and my consulting business, but looked at core people. These are the core people I need. The other people I can bring in and partner with us as we need, so I can shrink and grow as I need to without having massive layoffs. That way, your core people know that there's a loyalty, that you can build that trust.
Right.
Right. And so I think we're going to need to look at models that allow us to create engagement while we need to be fluid, because we have to make money. I mean, you and I both have run businesses. You can't survive unless you make money. Right? It's not either or. It should be, because of that, we're able to do this.
Right. How do you make people feel? I want to get kind of granular a little bit, sort of on a team level or an individual level. How do you make people feel appreciated?
I think it happens. It happens in a lot of different ways. It's usually in the little things where you see it the most. So I was in Hong Kong doing some work, and I was with my Japanese distributor there, and we had set up an office that we were doing some work there together. And so the office manager, Chinese, Hong Kongese, made a comment to me. She was doing some work, and I turned and I thanked her for what she had done. And she said, "You don't need to thank me. This is my job."
Right.
And I said, "It doesn't matter. I'm still very grateful for what you did." And you know what? It didn't matter after that what I asked her to do. She absolutely did it, because I thanked her publicly. I acknowledged her publicly. So in an Asian environment where who you are, it's what you contribute, how you're acknowledged, how you contribute to the group is important. I made her important to that group. So a simple thank you changed how she felt about being present. I think when we thank people, it should be public. It should happen as soon to the event as it possibly can be done. And we need to be very specific about what it is that we're grateful for, not a generic thank you. Thank you for having done X, Y, Z in the situation, and this is how it made a difference for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because then everybody gets in your system also what you value.
Smart. Yeah, that's very, very smart. How else do you think we can do that? I mean, as managers, we try to build teams and we try to build a culture of appreciation, a culture of inclusion. Are there other things you think we can do?
Yeah.
Because to me, this is not something that's expensive, right? This is easy.
Actually, team building is probably one of the cheapest things you do. It takes energy. That's why we tend not to do it. It takes a leader's energy generally. One of the things that I am really fascinated by right now is, what do we do when there's no trust in companies? Because team building, if you take a look at all of the research and the models that we have, they're predicated on trust. We start with, if you take Lencioni's model, for example, of the 5 behaviors for an effective team, it starts with trust. Then it comes, how do you deal with conflict and commitment, accountability, right? And you move on. So trust is our basic foundation where we begin. But you take a look at organizations like, at the university, when I first started there with the cancer patients, no one trusted anybody because it was chaotic.
Right.
It was depressing. You have, following a merger and acquisition, the same thing is true. It's like a war zone. You've eliminated a lot of positions, and people have all run for cover looking for how they're going to protect themselves, and they don't want to raise their head up just in case they might get overly noticed and the next one to be eliminated, right?
Right.
So we've got this environment that we've created right now that where we have organizations that don't have trust. And it's not that it's necessarily bad, it's a reality of change, I think. Disruption creates that sometimes as well. And so there's a part of me that's very pragmatic and says, okay, that can be real. How do we create then teams that function really well together when there isn't trust? And you and I are familiar with Marshall Goldsmith because we're both his, one of his coaches.
Right.
And I find his feed forward process absolutely brilliant because I can use that to build teams when there's no trust. You don't need trust to make that feed forward process work, right?
Right. That's true.
And then while you're doing that, you can start to grow and develop and build trust. So it doesn't have to be either or. You can begin right where you're at. There's processes out there.
Yeah, I agree. That's where do you see? You think that's a? I mean, to me, I see that a lot in my coaching. I see that there is a lack of trust, and I think it's something that leaders really struggle with on how to. If, for example, I'm coaching a young man now that is coming into a situation. It's a family business. His father's run it for 40 years, and he's in his 30s, young, and father's turned the business over to him. He'd never worked in the business, stayed as far away as possible from it, I think. And so he's coming into a situation where they don't trust him. And I think working with him to help build that trust, that stakeholder centered and that feed forward process, I think is a brilliant way for him to do it. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think you're right. I think that's going to be I think that's what's going to turn the corner for him when we do engage in that way. I think that's what's going to turn the corner for him.
So I think there's been some really wonderful work that's been done on perception gaps, Rhett, that I really value. And the reason I value it is when I was dealing with my son and we were going through issues at school, we were the family that other families said, don't play with him because if you do, you're going to catch what he's got, right? There was right? Even though it wasn't contagious, that's a fear we have as human beings. And so what I realized was and I didn't know this research at the time. I just sort of innately had it within me, but I have used this research so much since then, is that research has been done on kids that enter first grade. And what they have found is that in the first 15 minutes of first grade, the teacher has made a judgment, a determination about each child in the class. Unless something is done to change the opinion, that opinion then is handed on from teacher to teacher to teacher for 6 years. Unbelievable, right? So what happens when you're in an organization like what you're talking about, and there isn't trust?
That blows my mind. Okay, I'm sorry. That's sad.
It's very sad, but the same thing happens in corporations. You're in a work and a manager has a view. You may be promoted or put in another position, but that view is passed on, and it's passed on. So now what the person has to overcome is tremendous. How do you overcome it? It's the same issue that your young gentleman is dealing with. How does he change how people feel? So I think, with the feed forward process that Marshall talks about and measuring, it allows us to deal with perception gaps. So the workers perceive you as X, right?
Right.
And they will create things so that you can be what they've determined you to be.
Right.
And then they can say, yep, that is exactly who I said he was going to be, and that he is. Right? He hasn't disappointed me, and that goes on. So with the feed forward, what happens is people have the opportunity to say, here's one thing I'd like you to work on. You then work on it. You figure out an action plan. You go back and say, this is what I've done. How am I doing? That's the key issue, is how am I doing? Now the workers have to make a decision. Have you or haven't you changed? Their perception has to move. You don't have to, it doesn't have to now take 6 years. It can happen within a week, a month, whatever, right?
Time frame it, right, whatever. No, I think that's remarkable, because I think it also shows, to me, one of the biggest things that does is it says, look, I'm conscious of what you think. I care, and I want to fix it if there's an issue. And I want to be better at it because I want to be a better leader. And I think that gives you so much credibility with people. And I think that's what that builds.
And credibility is everything, isn't it? Because that really is one of the basic components of trust.
Yeah. I think you're right. Absolutely right. Why do we've talked about some benefit. We've already talked about some benefits, really, I think. What's your experience when you talk to people who are sort of on the fence about coaching? What is your, what do you say to them? I mean, what's the conversation like? I'm always fascinated with other coaches and what conversations they have and what people are saying to them, and how they talk them through those questions.
I think as we move up, we tend to think we're self-sufficient and really quite smart. Right? Don't we?
Yeah, we kind of think we're smart.
And I think we are. But being smart sometimes is one of our greatest deterrents to moving on to the next level. Mm-hmm. And so I think of myself with a little bit of humor. When I was taking one of the groups to Japan, one of the side things that was a part of it was there was a tennis exchange that was a part of this. Now, I hadn't played tennis since I was in college, a long time at that point, but I had this group, and I went to the health club, and I went to the tennis department, and I said, I'm taking a group of business people to Japan. And by the way, I have to play tennis. I haven't played tennis now, I think it was 25, 30 years. And I need you to get me to a 4.0 level. You have 6 lessons in which to do this. They laughed. They said, not possible. And I said, well, it doesn't matter. It's if work at it, at least I'll get somewhere close to a 2 anyway. And so we worked on it. So, but that's what I learned. See, I had a task that I was being asked to do way beyond where I was at.
Right.
And I wanted to get there. If I used my current skills, I wouldn't have hit the ball at all. Right. But I knew that if I was going to get there, I needed a coach. So I went to get a coach to get me to a place where I could at least be comfortable enough to navigate. That's what, to me, coaching is all about. It's taking a look at where are we at, where are we trying to get to, and how does somebody help us navigate to that? It's not that they imbue us with knowledge or wisdom. It's that they lead us there. Because on our own, we won't get there. I couldn't have gotten there as a tennis player without a coach.
Right.
Right. And this is true of every sport. You're not going to go into a sport. Our kids, if they play sports, they have a coach.
Right.
So only in business do we enter this thing that impacts our entire life. It impacts our economics. It impacts how we relate. Only there do we think that we can function without a coach. And then we wonder why we have problems and why we don't have engagement and why we don't have innovation, right?
Right. And we have low retention and we have a disengaged workforce and all that stuff. I think you're right. I think that's a brilliant analogy. I think it's one that I know I use. I talk about how, why do Olympic athletes, and professional athletes have coaches, and not only coaches, but they have nutritionists and they have physical therapists and they have a whole gamut of people that help them stay at a level that they're performing at. And I think, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you're a professional and you're working at a high level and you've got a lot of stress and you've got a lot on your shoulders, having somebody there to help you navigate that and to be at your best is something that you really, it's the ROI on it, I think, is remarkable. I think I've read a couple different studies on it, but it just makes sense.
I think Gallup tells us that it will go up by 22%.
Yeah.
So, it is remarkable. And many companies that have more of a tight grasp on employees and perhaps a more micromanaged negative perspective, I will hear say, well, we have a double-digit growth in our company, so why would we change and take this in and risk the double-digit growth? And I think to myself, if you are doing double digits without this, think of what you might be doing if you embrace this as well.
Well, having started a company and grown a company that did double-digit growth several years in a row, what it does is it does put you in danger. That pace that you're running at it, when you're doing that, you're going to burn people out. And if you don't think about some of these things and put programs in place to help people grow and manage that speed and that change and that pace, you're going to put that growth in danger, I think. I know it did for us. I mean, you just can't sustain that without help, and without help working on you, whether it's eating right, physical training. I mean, if you're not doing the things to take care of yourself at that pace, you're going to kill yourself. And one thing, so I totally get it. And one thing I think that we don't do is you hit on it a little bit ago, but it's that also that coaching, I think, can help us build a bench of new leadership. And I think we often, as at a corporate level, we ignore those managers and those directors, right? We don't give them the same training, the same coaching, and the same ability to grow. And I think that's a mistake too.
Right. I think the other thing, Rhett, is we're going to increasingly need to look as leaders at who do we build loose partnerships with? And so let me just explain what I mean by that a little bit. Our next solutions are going to come from looking at things very differently. One of the things that fascinates me in corporations is, what do we do with conflict? How do we manage differences of opinion? Because you have two people involved and you're going to always have a difference of opinion. How do we resolve it? We have models, we have all sorts of things. Why haven't we gotten further in this conversation with all the tools that we have? And so one of the places that I've started to look at within, just from my own research, but to really begin to gather this data for myself, is where are there models out there of people who are doing unusual things, not perfectly, but at least they're approaching it. And is there a lesson there for us to learn? So one of the places that I'm looking at right now is Rwanda, and the leader of Rwanda, Kagame.
Interesting
right?
guy.
Very interesting guy. And he's come out.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Fascinating place, by the way, but we can talk about that offline.
He came to a country leadership where there was incredible genocide, and he's trying to pull all of this together. That's conflict, high level conflict, right? And yet he's doing it. How is he doing it? And I think these are the kinds of things that we're going to need to be asking more and more, and then perhaps creating sort of pools, network pools, where people that are having these similar questions can go to partner and say, I need help looking at, you've done this well, coach me through this part, because that's what I'm struggling with right now. Our next bit of disruption, I think, is going to be so disruptive. We're going to have those kinds of creative skills in order to navigate them, I think. It's just a thought. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, so we don't know that, but I do think that is going to be our challenge.
I don't disagree. What's the best, the last question I always ask, what's the best advice you ever got, and who gave it to you?
Everything starts from a sense of hope. So if you don't have hope, you have no future. So I can remember when my son was 12 years old and I was putting him to bed, and we were still in the throes of not knowing whether or not there were possibilities ahead for him. And he was sitting on the edge of his bed and, just having conversation like you normally do with children. And he said to me, Mom, do you think there's even a plan for me? And what he was really asking me was, is there hope for me? Right? So I knelt down next to him and I looked him in the eyes and I said, you know what? I don't know of adults who have gone through what you've gone through. And if you have gone through all of this, you have insights and understanding most humans don't have. I said, I don't think God ever wastes that. You have a future, trust me. And, that was, it sustained him for a while anyway. But that is what we look for. Where's their hope? That's what our cancer patients were asking for. Where's their hope? That's what employees look for. Is there hope that I belong here, that there's a future if I give you my all? So never lose sight of hope.
That is powerful. And I bet that was a defining moment for him in his young life. I bet he remembers that to this day.
I think it was defining for all of us. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and sharing everything that you shared today. I think there were some really amazing things there for people to take away. And thank you for spending your lunch hour or your hour with us, no matter where you are in the world. Somewhere in some places it's lunch. some places it's late afternoon, but nonetheless, thank you for spending some time with us here on Power Lunch Live. We've got a great lineup coming up the rest of this week. We've got Joel Comm. We're going to talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. I've got Benjamin Joffe. We're going to talk about venture capital. I've also got Joel Solomon. He leads one of the largest venture capital firms in Canada that is mission based. So we just got some really interesting conversations this week. Please join us. You can check out the schedule on powerlunch.live and have a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow. Or actually, we'll see you this afternoon, late this afternoon. I think it's 1 o'clock Pacific time and 4 o'clock on Eastern Standard Time. So until then, we'll see you later.